It was a night, a dark, sunken April night. 3 ships moved slowly through the Caribbean. No flags, no markings, no identity. Just 1,400 men hidden in the dark, believing they were going to take their country back. They were told the mission would be easy. They were told the Cuban people would receive them as heroes. They were told that the most powerful intelligence agency in the world, the CIA, was with them every step of the way. They were told a lot of things, but the one thing nobody told them was the truth. And the truth, when it arrived, was written in blood. This is not just a story about a failed military operation. This is a story about deception, about institutional arrogance, about men in suits making decisions that got other men killed on a beach. This is the story of the moment when America, the most powerful nation on earth, made a move so catastrophically miscalculated that the world came to the edge of nuclear war. This is the story of the Bay of Pigs, and it is still relevant today. The year was 1959. Fidel Castro, a young, fiery revolutionary, was walking the streets of Havana. Fulgencio Batista, the American-backed dictator who had bled Cuba dry for decades, had fled. For the Cuban people, this was a moment of liberation. But in Washington, inside the Oval Office, in the secure briefing rooms of the CIA, a very different calculation was underway. A communist leader 90 miles from Florida? That was not something America was prepared to accept. President Dwight Eisenhower signed a top-secret order. The CIA was given a green light: reverse Castro's revolution in Cuba by any means necessary. CIA Director Allen Dulles assembled his core team, the men who operated in the shadow world, where there were no cameras, no congressional oversight, no accountability. The plan, on paper, was straightforward. The Cuban exile community, thousands of men living in Miami who had lost their homes, their businesses, their land to Castro, would be recruited, trained, armed, and inserted back into Cuba, not as an American army, as Cubans reclaiming their homeland. The idea was elegant in its simplicity. The plan was named Operation Zapata, codename Bay of Pigs. And that name would go down in history as America's most embarrassing covert failure.
Deep in the jungles of Guatemala, the CIA built secret training camps, hidden from journalists, hidden from Congress, hidden from the world. This is where Brigade 2506 was born. 1,400 Cuban exile fighters, each one carrying a personal wound. These were men who had lost everything: their land, their businesses, their families, their country. Inside each of them burned a single desire: to go home, to take Cuba back. American CIA instructors trained them in guerrilla warfare, amphibious assault tactics, and infiltration techniques. Every day brought brutal training, and every night these fighters dreamed of Havana, of being back in their own streets, back with their families. What none of them knew was that while they trained to reclaim their homeland, the CIA was constructing a fantasy, a plan that looked bulletproof on paper but had almost no connection to reality on the ground. November 1960, America elected a new president, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, just 43 years old, the youngest man ever elected to the office. Energetic, charismatic, confident, the embodiment of a new America. Camelot, they called it. But before Kennedy was even inaugurated, the CIA came to him. Allen Dulles and Deputy Director Richard Bissell arrived at the Oval Office with a polished, well-rehearsed briefing. The plan was already months in motion. The force was trained, the logistics was set. All they needed was the president's go-ahead. Kennedy asked questions. The CIA gave smooth, confident answers. "This will work, Mr. President. We have planned for every contingency." Kennedy was skeptical, but he approved it with one firm condition: American involvement must remain invisible. Plausible deniability was everything. The CIA said, "Don't worry, no American fingerprints anywhere." It was one more lie on a growing list. April 14th, 1961, just 2 days before D-Day. Phase 1 of the CIA's plan was to destroy Cuba's Air Force first. Without air power, Castro couldn't stop an amphibious landing. 8 B-26 bombers flew out of Nicaragua, painted in Cuban Air Force markings to look like defectors. Their mission? Destroy Cuba's airfields. The planes arrived, the bombs fell. But when the smoke cleared, only about 1/4 of Castro's Air Force had been destroyed. The CIA had assumed one strike would finish the job. It didn't. And now, Castro, already suspicious, was on full alert. The element of surprise, the one thing a covert operation cannot afford to lose, was gone. Then Kennedy made another decision, arguably the most costly mistake of the entire operation. The second airstrike, scheduled before D-Day to finish off Castro's remaining Air Force, was canceled. Why? Because at the United Nations, Cuba had already raised hell. Ambassador Adlai Stevenson, America's own UN representative, had unknowingly assured the Security Council that the attacks were not American operations. When he discovered the truth, he was furious and humiliated, and the world was starting to connect the dots. Kennedy, fearing complete diplomatic exposure, pulled the plug on the second strike. CIA planners were blindsided. Deputy Director Bissell personally warned Kennedy that without air cover, the brigade would be completely exposed. Kennedy didn't move, and that single decision, made in a quiet Washington conference room, became the death warrant for Brigade 2506. April 17, 1961. In the darkness of the night, in the cold water of the Bay of Pigs, Brigade 2506's fighters sat in small landing crafts, moving toward the beachhead, holding their breath, carrying Cuba in their hearts. But from the very first minutes, everything started going wrong. The CIA's maps had missed a coral reef just offshore. The brigade's boats started striking the reef. Engines sputtered. Some boats got stuck. Then there were lights. The CIA had planned to silence local militia guards before the landing. That plan had failed. A local Cuban worker spotted the boats in Bahia de Cochinos and radioed in a report, and Castro received the news. Castro was not the kind of leader who stayed in his headquarters issuing orders over the telephone. When the news came, he personally drove to the front. Map in hand, eyes sharp and focused, he understood clearly. These were not just exile fighters. This was the CIA. This was America. And if he lost here, Cuba was finished. He did not lose. Castro personally directed his forces, moving armor, repositioning artillery, cutting off the brigade's escape routes one by one. He was fighting for his revolution, his country, his life, and it showed in every decision he made. In the first 24 hours of the invasion, the operation collapsed in real time. The brigade had no air cover. Castro's T-33 jet trainers and Sea Fury fighter planes owned the sky, hunting. 2 main supply ships, the Rio Escondido and the Houston, took direct hits and went down. These weren't just ships, they were the brigade's ammunition reserves, their medical supplies, their communication equipment, their backup weapons, everything gone in a matter of minutes, sinking into the Caribbean. On the beach, brigade fighters fought with extraordinary courage, outgunned, outnumbered, and completely abandoned. Many were killed, many were captured, and all of them were realizing the same thing. None of what they had been promised had materialized. No mass uprising from the Cuban public, no air cover, no American cavalry coming over the horizon. Brigade commanders sent frantic radio messages pleading for help. "We are under attack. We need air support. Where is the backup?" In Washington, in the Oval Office, Kennedy and his senior advisors sat gathered together. CIA officials, military brass, cabinet members, all of them in a quiet white room. And a few hundred miles away, 1,400 men were dying on a beach. Admiral Arleigh Burke, one of America's most decorated naval officers, directly requested Kennedy's authorization. Just one destroyer, Mr. President, one ship. It could provide enough cover to change the outcome. Kennedy said no. Burke asked again. Kennedy said no again.
It is said that Admiral Burke, a man who had seen real war, who had commanded men in combat, had tears in his eyes that night. He later said it was the most shameful thing he had ever witnessed.
72 hours. That was all Operation Zapata lasted. On April 19, 1961, Brigade 2506 surrendered. 1,189 fighters were captured. 114 Cuban exile fighters and 4 American CIA contractors were killed. Castro called a massive victory rally in Havana. He stood before hundreds of thousands of Cubans and declared that the revolution had defeated American imperialism. The world was watching, and what the world saw was this: America had planned a covert operation, executed it, and failed, publicly, completely, catastrophically. In Washington, a heavy silence settled in. Kennedy publicly stepped forward and took full responsibility. No deflection, no blame shifting. At a press conference, he said, "Victory has 100 fathers, but defeat is an orphan. I am responsible." It was a moment of genuine accountability that earned him a strange kind of respect, even in the depths of failure. But once the cameras were off and the Oval Office doors closed, Kennedy's rage exploded. At the CIA, at Dulles, at Bissell, at every person who had sold him a guaranteed plan that had fallen apart in 72 hours. He reportedly said he wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. These were words born from the deepest kind of betrayal, the kind where you trust professionals, they tell you everything is under control, and then you watch it burn. So what actually went wrong? Historians have spent decades carefully picking this apart, and the failures are multiple, layered, and devastating. The first was a fundamental intelligence failure. CIA analysts had assessed that Cuba's population was ready to rise up against Castro, but this was projection, not intelligence. In 1961, Castro was still genuinely popular. Land reforms were being implemented. Literacy programs were running across the country. The Cuban people were not secretly waiting for exile fighters to arrive as liberators. They did not rise up because they did not want to. The picture that CIA analysts had painted bore almost no resemblance to the reality on the ground, and nobody with the power to stop the operation had the honesty or the courage to say so. The second failure lay in the planning assumptions. Brigade 2506 had 1,400 fighters. Castro's Revolutionary Armed Forces had 25,000 trained soldiers, plus an active militia, plus genuine popular support. The math never worked. CIA planners knew this, and their answer was always the same. The mass uprising would make up the difference. It was a plan that required a miracle to succeed. Miracles do not show up on command. The third failure was political interference at the worst possible moment. Kennedy's cancellation of the second airstrike, while perhaps understandable from a diplomatic standpoint, was militarily catastrophic. Any military strategist will tell you that you do not launch an amphibious assault without air superiority. It is not a guideline, it is a rule. By pulling the airstrike to avoid diplomatic embarrassment at the United Nations, Kennedy took away the one thing that might have given Brigade 2506 a fighting chance. The gap between what was militarily necessary and what was politically acceptable became a gap that 1,400 men fell through.
The fourth failure was institutional, what psychologists today call groupthink. Inside the CIA's planning process, there was so much internal pressure to make this operation work that critical voices were quietly silenced or simply ignored. People who had doubts didn't raise them loudly enough. People who saw serious problems buried them in footnotes. When everyone in a room is deeply invested in the same outcome, the room loses its ability to see reality clearly. Bay of Pigs became a textbook example of groupthink, and it is still studied today at Harvard Business School and military academies across the country to illustrate the same single point: consensus is not the same as correctness. And then came the largest, most dangerous consequence, the one that is perhaps least discussed.
After Bay of Pigs, Castro, who was already leaning toward the Soviet Union, fully embraced the USSR. He publicly declared Cuba a socialist state. Moscow welcomed him with open arms, and now, on America's doorstep in the Caribbean, there was a Soviet-aligned communist state that had just successfully repelled an American-backed invasion. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev watched all of this with great interest, and he drew a conclusion. Kennedy is weak, a young, inexperienced president who couldn't commit to his own operation, who blinked, who could be pushed. That miscalculation by Khrushchev, born directly from Bay of Pigs, led him to take an extraordinarily dangerous gamble. October 1962, Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. The Cuban Missile Crisis. 13 days when the entire world stood at the edge of nuclear annihilation. There is a direct, traceable line from Bay of Pigs to the missile crisis. One covert failure almost produced a nuclear catastrophe. Kennedy was haunted by the men of Brigade 2506. Secret negotiations were undertaken. Robert Kennedy personally involved in brokering a deal with Fidel Castro. $53 million worth of food and medicine in exchange for the release of the captured fighters. December 1962, a few days before Christmas, 1,113 fighters who had spent 20 months in Cuban jails gathered at Miami's Orange Bowl Stadium. Kennedy went there himself. He shook their hands. He looked at them, these men who had trusted, who had gone, who had fought and been captured. Kennedy took the Brigade 2506 flag in his hands and made a public promise. This flag will be returned to this brigade in a free Havana. That promise was never kept. Kennedy was assassinated on November 22, 1963. Havana never became free. Allen Dulles resigned. Richard Bissell, the man who had architected the entire operation, resigned. General Charles Cabell resigned. The people who had built this plan, who had sold it as foolproof, quietly walked out the door one by one. Cuba remained. Castro remained. The Cold War burned on, only now more dangerous than before. There is also a darker question that historians have raised. Did CIA planners actually believe this operation would succeed as designed? Some evidence suggests that senior CIA planners knew the covert operation alone would probably not work, but they expected that once it began to fail, Kennedy would feel politically and morally compelled to authorize direct U.S. military intervention, a kind of structural trap, not deliberately set as a betrayal, but built into the architecture of the plan. Either the covert operation succeeds or the president escalates. Both outcomes produce the CIA's desired result, regime change in Cuba. Kennedy did not follow that script. He chose a third option, half commitment, and half commitment in situations like this produces complete failure.
The survivors of Brigade 2506 settled in Miami. Little Havana was born, a vibrant, resilient community that kept Cuban culture alive in exile. They opened businesses, built schools, raised families, and told their children where they came from and where home really was. For generations, these families lived in America with Cuba in their hearts, an unfulfilled longing, a wound that never fully closed. Many of them are gone now. Those who remain are old. But the story of Brigade 2506 lives on in Florida, in Miami, deep in the DNA of the Cuban-American community. Cuba is still there. Castro transferred power to his brother Raúl in 2008 and died in 2016. But the system he built outlasted him, outlasted Kennedy, outlasted the Cold War itself. More than 60 years after Bay of Pigs, the failure of that operation still casts a shadow over Cuba-America relations. The operation that was designed to end Castro's Cuba ended up cementing it. Bay of Pigs is not just a piece of history. It is a warning that remains relevant. It is a warning about what happens when intelligence becomes a tool to confirm what powerful people already want to believe, rather than a tool to discover what is actually true. It is a warning about what happens when secrecy eliminates accountability. It is a warning about what happens when military operations are designed by committee, filtered through political fear, and executed with half measures. All of this happened at once, in 1961, on a Caribbean beach, in 72 hours. Today, on that beach at the Bay of Pigs, there is no American memorial. There is no monument. There is only water and Cuban soil, and the kind of silence that settles only in places where something enormous happened and the world stopped going there. The fighters of Brigade 2506 appear in history books as a footnote. Cuban exiles trained by CIA. A small sentence. But they were not a footnote. They were men who had already lost everything once, their homes, their land, their country, and had then been handed a dream of getting it all back. The CIA's dream was beautiful, it was glittering, it was perfectly constructed, but it was never their dream. It was a Cold War chess move, a geopolitical gambit. And when that gambit failed, the chess pieces did not go back in the box. They drowned in the cold, salt water of the Bay of Pigs. Some nations remember their victories. The truly great ones also remember their failures, not to wallow in them, but to understand them, to be unflinching about them, to ensure that the same arrogance, the same institutional blindness, the same willingness to substitute hope for honesty does not produce the same catastrophe again. America remembered Bay of Pigs as a management case study, a bureaucratic lesson, an intelligence reform talking point. What was remembered far less were the 1,400 men who carried a dream onto that beach, who were used as pieces in a plan, and who, when the plan fell apart, were left there alone. April 17, 1961. That night never really ended. Some nights in history change the entire world, and some nights change the entire world quietly, and the world only understands what happened decades later. Bay of Pigs was the second kind of night, the night that America entered on the strength of a false dream, and the night that some men never came back from. Dreaming is human nature, but when a dream is built on deception, when the people who send others to die already know the plan is broken, it stops being a dream. It becomes darkness. And in that darkness, in the cold, salt water of that Caribbean bay, the dream of 1,400 men went under, while back in Washington, men in suits were already thinking about their next move.